The reason why this was picked, partly selfish, because a lot of my research begins to draw upon some of the themes that Professor Hall kind of makes and engages within this paper. I'm a school teacher, I guess, by profession and trade. I've always been interested in how we can engage in dialogue, talk, to advance learning, but learning for the development of consciousness, as opposed to the learning of as opposed to solely the advancement of particular educational outcomes. And for anyone who has worked in schools, I've worked in many secondary schools across the country and further afield. The way in which we engage in dialogue, whether it's verbal or non-verbal communication, is a vital part of the way in which we transmit consciousness, we transmit educational values, ways of knowing, understanding, being. As Black educators who are a minority in classrooms in the United Kingdom, certainly in England and in Wales, those themes of verbal and non-verbal communication are vitally important with all of our young people, but in particular the young people who may recognize themselves within our quote unquote embodiment. On screen, I've put a number of images which relate to educators who I think have been really, really important in terms of engaging with the themes of this reading, that idea of what are we talking about when we're talking about Black in popular Black culture. I'll go from left to right. Beryl Gilroy, London's first Black head teacher. Tony Saul, who was until recently the chair of the Commission for Racial Disparity, who reported in April 2021. Professor Heidi Merzer, who has done amazing work over the last 30 years. And we've engaged with some of her work previously as part of the book club. Family friend, colleague, comrade, Aisha Thomas, who's based in Bristol. Representation Matters, and has just does amazing work and continues to do so. The late, great, wonderful friend, colleague, comrade, mentor, wonderful educator, former president of the National Union of Teachers, and ally, when we use it as a word to describe how we want communities to engage with emancipatory movements, isn't a word that is that does justice to the works and words that Miss Nina did. So it's important that if we're talking about Black educators, for me, I place her as part of this story. And of course, I've got Professor Stuart Hall on the right-hand side. There are also so many more people that I could have included here, as I'm sure you're aware. Okay, so let's get into some of my kind of observations around this really, really important piece. In terms of, it's important to kind of position Professor Stuart Hall, I guess, and kind of to a certain extent understand where he's coming from. And depending on the audience that are watching this, some are going to be aware of his work, some others are not. And Professor Hall, these are almost the words that I've got on screen are taken from him. So he's born in Jamaica, his family were middle class. Within that context of colonial Jamaica, he left JA in 1951, academically brilliant. He won a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford. While at Oxford, as part of that quote unquote Windrush generation, omnipresent on our TV screens, supporting young academics, creative communities, filmmakers, institutions, mentored many, supported many, including Professor Paul Gilroy and so many others. I've got some quick references at the bottom, which you can look at a later point, and they begin to speak to some of the spaces and themes that Professor Hall was involved in. What's probably the most important thing is Professor Hall was one of the first people that, as an academic, that I saw on TV as a kid, and was articulating an experience that I, to a certain extent, I could understand, or certainly I'd seen around me. And he offered groundbreaking ways of thinking about discourses of race, culture, and identity within our UK spaces, but in particular within our educational spaces. Don't sleep on Professor Hall's work. Okay. So that being said, recognizing where Professor Hall's positionality kind of emanates from, he posed this question in 1992-93, and it's in the opening lines of this paper. What sort of moment is this in which to pose the question of Black popular culture? He was asking that question, I guess, at a time of what we could now reflect upon as being a time of significant change. The images on the screen relate to that. And I'll focus on the images first and then talk about the kind of words that he said. And so we've got to think of 1992 as a point in time when South Africa has just in effect been emancipated. Nelson Mandela is free, government is being formed. Nelson Mandela is traveling to the UK. The images on the right hand side is of him in Glasgow, where he's presented as a world leader, but not just that, a hero of emancipatory movements. Stephen Lawrence, Stephen is with us. I guess what we now know Stephen for hasn't happened yet, and I'm the same age as Stephen, and so I describe that time as one where many of our families, our quote unquote middle class families who had been worked for the last 20, 30 years, had got to a point where potentially their dreams could be realized through education. For us, we could go on and do something. We wouldn't have to work in some of the spaces that they did, whether it was in retail, whether it was in factories, whether it was on public transport. There was a hope that there was something else there for us, and our families really drilled it, certainly for me, drilled it into our minds that we should grab onto that. So we saw record numbers of Black and brown young people going into university for the first time, and in other spaces. We're also at the point of the post-92 universities, where you've also got an expansion of the higher education sector as well. And so we have to understand those different things that are going on in relation to this moment. Access is being given. Maya Angelou has just spoken at the beginning of the year, has just spoken at the inauguration of Bill Clinton, who was then described as the first Black president. Yes, this will sound strange to many younger viewers, but that was the reality. Jeremy Corbyn was, as now, a backbencher for Labour, but he was also really closely connected to the first four Black MPs, so Keith Vaz, Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, etc., Paul Boateng. And you can, in the image that we've got on screen, Bernie Grant is right in the centre there. He died in 2000, but again, his influence is really important. These are people who are completely shifting the narrative of what we're talking about when we're talking about Black culture. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, sorry, I've got an image of Toni Morrison, who had won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992. So you've almost got this second Black Renaissance emanating from the United States, and the headline in the middle, "Wiggers just want to be blacks," is speaking to almost, and it's from the Independent, that was written in 1992, 93, and it is almost speaking to this concern that there is a shift in the way in which young, quote unquote, young white middle class kids are engaging with Black culture in terms of its adoption, whether it's through fashion, whether it's through language literacy, it's listening to music, and so on and so forth. And so there's almost a moral panic of fear amongst some of our established communities that a takeover is about to happen. That context is really important, because if we then look at what Professor Hall wrote to kind of describe it much more succinctly than I've just explained, he's posing this question in a moment of where there is, to paraphrase, and he's drawing upon the work of Cornel West and Professor Cornel West as well, displacement of European models of quote unquote high culture. So what is high culture is being questioned and redefined. Redefinition of our centers of global production. I've already spoken about the influence of the United States, and you've seen that in some of the images that I've made reference to. And so there's a shift. The places that we thought were the epitome of high culture, whether it's France, Great Britain, Italy, those things are being shifted. And third and foremost, the decolonization of the global South. Decolonization, which is a really important word, was an important word then. It's got a completely different energy and power now. As I articulated through civil rights, Black struggles, and understood in the consciousness mind, or the minds of the diaspora. And so Professor Hall is posing a question, but offering a context which, if we move on one slide, completely resonates with where we're at today. What's even more remarkable is that Professor Hall had made the point in 1993 that historical context and its specificity is important, but ones-on-ones, we should also recognize that the moment and each moment is different. You can see, hopefully, in the images that I've picked at the bottom of our screen, which kind of relate to the themes of 1992, 1993, but are different. But are different. We've got amazing authors. We have got social movements, the movement for Black Lives. We have got a political narrative following Brexit, following the contention around Europe, the discourse that relates to our migrant family, the shifting and changing of connections with Commonwealth as epitomized by Prime Minister Motley of Barbados, as well as the, and I wouldn't call it the rise of, but the increased profile of Black conservatism within our political spaces, notwithstanding then the global dominance of people like Jay-Z and Beyonce as cultural producers. All of those things are happening, yet within educational spaces, we continue to recognize, despite the emphasis on representation, the emphasis on increasing recruitment, if young Black people are disproportionately expected to fail, cultures are devalued. Progress in relation to other communities, probably apart from our Gypsy Roma family, continue to be stubborn in terms of their profile. And our institutional responses appear to be not to think about decoloniality, to think about transformation and social justice, but actually to offer emphasis on white working class boys, for example. Professor Hall makes the point that on screen that now cultural strategies that can make a difference, that's what he's interested in those that can make a difference, can shift the dispositions of power. He acknowledges that the space is one, and I would make the argument that within the context of education, some of the equality, diversity, and inclusion work, which emanates from that time of the 1990s, which was one, but now is being lost, for differences far and few between, and that they are carefully policed and regulated. As educators, whether we work in schools, whether we work in community education, or whether we work in higher education, I think leaning into those words of careful policing and regulation is really, really important. And then thinking about it in context of Black educators, i.e. thinking about sanction, control, and surveillance that is enacted upon Black educators within our educational context is also important. The outcome of that is low levels of representation, low levels of retention, greater likelihood of sanction, referral to prevent, and other problematic spaces and places. So for me, Professor Hall's work in 1993 completely resonates with today and demand that we ask really important questions to acknowledge what is the same, but also what is different. So Professor Hall speaks about Black popular culture in a particular way. And I guess I am learning to do the same. As you know, I haven't offered a definition of Black popular culture, whether that is as a racialized identity, whether it is in its political context, which is very unique to the UK, or as a cultural expression. Instead, I kind of, to a certain extent, follow what Professor Hall says, which is Black popular culture is a contradictory space. It is a site of strategic consternation. And to offer binary oppositions or binary definitions of it is going to always become really problematic. Professor Hall says that those binary oppositions are still used, we still use them to offer our definitions. And so we kind of offer high-low, resistance versus incorporation or assimilation, authentic versus unauthentic, experiential versus formal, and oppositional versus homogenization. I've offered some images at the bottom, which I think really push us to think about that. So on the left, you've got an image of Adele, the singer, who went to Notting Hill Carnival. She's wearing Bantu knots. She's got a Jamaica bikini. She's raving. And there was a significant backlash when this image was posted on social media at the time. But didn't necessarily, in my view, speak to the reality that Adele, as a young person who grew up in Tottenham, had grown up literally as part of the kind of cultural experience that she's expressing in this image. Because she's a multi-million pound earning singer and world famous, it doesn't mean that she didn't used to go raving at Carnival when she didn't have any money. And so we've got to look a little bit more deeply at what's happening here. Similarly, the next picture along is that of the Mau Mau community in Kenya. And in recent times, there has been some very quiet admissions by the British government of paying compensations to the descendants of the Mau Mau for the atrocities that were enacted on the community, a community that were fighting for liberation. And so there is acknowledgement of those atrocities. It's really important to note that this is a story that's still not taught in our schools. It's not part of our history curriculum. It is something that literally is airbrushed, even though eventually it's something that, following court cases, this government or successive governments have now chosen to acknowledge, but not acknowledge within the teaching of schools. We've got an image of Marcus Rashford, a mural of Marcus Rashford, and the experiences of Marcus Rashford and the other Black English footballers wearing the Union Jack as part of their football costume, the England flags that are in this image being rightfully promoted as a symbol of success, offers a contradiction in that for many there's a real tension in that, because the experiences that Rashford, Sacco and Sancho went through in the summer many of them were to be expected by many in the Black community. Similarly, the governmental response to it was to be expected. It is only when popular opinion demanded that these boys were treated with the love, respect and care that they deserve that we see our institutions offering a different way of thinking about them. And as a result, their works and words, these images are used by teachers across the country, used in schools as a symbol of progress. But that story at the heart of it is often missing. And of course, the final one is Mary Seacole, who is omnipresent in terms of our school curriculums. She is rightfully taught alongside people like Florence Nightingale as a symbol of somebody who made a great contribution to, quote unquote, the nation. But the fight to get Mary Seacole's name in the curriculum is again omitted. It's been adopted and adapted. And so there's a real tension there, because now, as my young niece said to me the other day, the only person we hear about is Mary Seacole, and we don't hear about Nanny Queen of the Maroons or anybody else. And so those contradictions continue to be problematic, and we should continue to ask difficult, probing and problematizing questions about what we are talking about, certainly as educators, when we're talking about Black popular culture. So popular culture carries, and Professor Hall says this in the paper, the word popular becomes problematized, doesn't it? Because it offers an affirmation. Popular culture is it has its base in experiences, the pleasures, the memories and traditions of the people. But who are we talking about when we're talking about the people who make Black popular culture popular? When we're talking, and this is where this begins to link to my research area, if we think about the space of education, where we as educators are beginning to pick resources so that we can talk about whole communities, diverse communities, distinct communities, are we picking things that are popular? And who decides what's popular or important? And so maybe those are the questions that we need to kind of really draw into. Professor Hall in this paper makes a lot of links to a Russian philosopher called Mikhail Bakhtin. And Bakhtin spoke a lot about dialogue and the dialogic, the talk, engaging with people. But he also made this distinction in terms of culture with the vulgar, the popular that is described as the vulgar, the informal, the undecided, the grotesque. And those words are words that we can, if we think about the way in which Black culture, popular Black culture, and even Black culture generally, whether it's historical, contemporary, or in the future, has been presented, it has always been linked to that underside, that grotesque or that informal. And that, as a result, it is always located as a counterpoise to the elite or high culture. And it's a site of alternative traditions. If we think about the experiences of Black educators, very rarely do you hear Black educators being located as educators. Instead, our work, our words, our context, our traditions, our histories are located as somewhere alternative, unless, and you remember I had my images of some of our Black conservative community, unless the narrative is being pushed for quote unquote appropriation. Professor Hall in this paper wrote a couple of paragraphs right at the end where he alluded to a way forward. And I appreciate I've skipped so much out of this paper, but I'm just picking the stuff that really resonated with me. And Professor Hall made this point that Black popular culture is an arena that is mythic. I would make the argument, I think when you say mythic, that draws to me spiritual. And when we talk about spiritual, maybe I need to define what I mean by spiritual, but mythic is a great word. Oh, and he goes on to say, although the terrain of the popular, and we spoke about popular in the last slide, Black popular culture looks like it's constructed with single binaries, but it isn't. Blackness isn't one thing, it's a myriad of things. Professor Hall has reminded us about the importance of structuring our cultural spaces, whether that's in education, whether that's in the media, it doesn't matter where, in terms of high and low. And we need to disrupt that. I would make the argument that much of the work that we're engaged in at the moment is part of that disruption. That's what Bakhtin describes as the carnivalesque. But Professor Hall makes a really, really astute point here. That idea of the carnivalesque, the disruption, is not simply about upturning two things that remain locked. It's not about upturning, quote unquote, English culture with Black culture, which is where I would argue the cultural wars has been framed. There's also a crosscut, which is called the dialogic, the space in between, the space of navigation and negotiation, the space of additive ways of understanding, knowing, reproducing and producing cultures. It's what Bakhtin calls the dialogic. Bakhtin isn't the only person who speaks about the dialogic, but in this paper, Professor Hall makes reference to the dialogic. And so Professor Hall goes on to say that thinking about that space in between is a better strategy than anyone that is rooted in an essentialist one, i.e. Black popular culture being solely the preserve of Blackness as a racialized identity. Professor Hall argues that though achievements of cultural struggles can be limited, they are also real. He opposes the reliance on essentialism. So I am essentially Black, so therefore I am a proponent of Black culture. I guess I'm drawing attention now to that Adele picture. In discussions of Black popular culture, as it takes racial difference out of its historical, cultural and political context and presents it as something biological and universal. And if we think about our academic spaces, we often talk about race and racialized identities as being a social construct. That doesn't mean they're not real. It just means that they are a social construct. So Professor Hall says that essentialism only reinforces the racist strategies that are trying to break down, that it is trying to break down by considering that racial differences are natural. Again, that's a really important, those last 2 points are really important because we see that discourse being taken to a different degree with some of our Black conservative community within the educational spaces, because there's then the counterpoint is, oh, you know, we are operating in an equal space. The discourse of power is removed from this, whereas Professor Hall continues to talk to power and hegemonic forces. For me, there are some big misses in this paper, but Professor Hall kind of speaks to them. So I guess they're not misses, it's just stuff that this is the scope of what I'm going to write about. And so Professor Hall on page 109 says, there are deep questions here of cultural transmission and inheritance, which I think is huge, and of the complex relations between African origins and the irreversible scatterings of diaspora, questions I cannot go into. And I would make the argument here that this is a great segue into drawing your attention to the work of Professor Paul Gilroy and the Black Atlantic and its influence on the way in which we see the world today. So on that first point, almost Professor Hall is saying, I'm not going to do this, but just look at my guy over here. And so if you go to the work of Professor Paul Gilroy and start maybe with There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, and then go on to the Black Atlantic, I think that there is an exploration that maybe Professor Gilroy goes into that Professor Hall doesn't go into. They're not necessarily going to be the same, but I think it's just an important segue. There are many other writers that you can be signposted to as well at this point. Professor Hall goes on to say that I do believe that these repertoires of Black popular culture, recognizing since we were excluded from the cultural mainstream, were often the only spaces we had left, were overdetermined from at least two directions. They were partly determined from their inheritance, but they were also critically determined by the diasporic conditions in which the connections were forged. So we do our work in the spaces and places that we have available to it, but that work is mystic, would be my summarizing of that. And I think that's a really powerful point. I think I've already spoken about this and made reference to our Black conservatives. Professor Hall in the paper made a lot of references to the Wiggers, so white working class young people who adopted some of the cultural significances of Black identities. We see a lot of that, and he speaks about Black conservatives as well. But in summary, that focus on Black as the signifier as identity could definitely lead to other forms of cultural oppression as well. And thinking about Black popular culture as a diverse space, completely contradictory, and it cannot be simplified in binary oppositions. Okay, this is a provocation by me. And so when we're thinking about these terms of culture as dialogic, which is in my view, one of Professor Hall's big points in this paper, I go to a quote by Bakhtin, who says, life is dialogic and a shared event. Living is participating in dialogue. Meaning comes through dialogue at whatever level that dialogue takes place. Those conversations. Nothing can exist without meaning. Everything has meaning. But, okay, we've gone into deep philosophical articulations here. But if we as educators apply some of those ideas to examples of contemporary Black culture, do we have to begin to unpack how we relate to contemporary Black popular culture within the context of our living experiences? I've put 3 images on screen. One is of Jessie Nelson, who former singer of the band Little Mix, who very recently was accused of blackfishing, as it's known. She's a white British woman, but has been regularly accused of adopting the aesthetic of Black women as a means to further her career. She denies this. Singers like Nicki Minaj have come out and denied it as well. In the middle, we've got an image from, I think it's Bridgerton, the name of the TV show, and the context of that show has asked deep questions of, this is popular culture, yes, but is this Black popular culture? Is this what we're talking about? And on the right, we've got an image of the educationalist, I believe he describes himself as, Calvin Robinson, who I think is, anyone who observed would safely describe him as a Black conservative. Please note that I have not used any derogatory terms to describe any of the people in this presentation. Because that's part of the work. And I could say a lot of stuff about any of the people here that I disagree with, including Calvin Robinson. But we need to be able to unpack how we relate to some of the contemporary Black popular cultural discourses in relation to our own positionalities, in a way that Professor Hall did and does. Okay. And so where do I fit in? I said at the beginning I was an educator. There are 2 bits of Professor Hall's paper that have always just kind of got me. And it's this idea that Black popular culture is an arena that is profoundly mythic, which I know, of course it is, but within the educational spaces that I operate, even in the educational discourses that I have with some Black educators, that is lost. And that's lost for a lot of reasons. And leaning into that idea of what is mythic is also lost. And it's a question of positionality. But there are some common threads that in the dialogues that we have, in the spaces that are left for us, where I see that profound mythic that Professor Hall speaks to, I experience it. I sense the transformational power that Paulo Freire speaks to. I engage in a reasoning that is transcendent. And it doesn't happen once or twice, that happens again and again and again. And so those are spaces that I'm interested in understanding more and being able to articulate. And the second thing is this idea of the deep questions here of cultural transmission and inheritance and the complex relations between African origins and the irreversible scatterings of diaspora. Those questions that Professor Hall couldn't go into, I guess I'm kind of trying to lean into a little bit. I'm not putting myself next to Professor Hall. I'm just simply following the path that he laid out for us all, just to see if I can offer a utterance or a reasoning that might make sense to ones or ones. So I guess that's it. So in conclusion, the paper is deep, and I guess there's a whole body of work that I'm engaged in that hopes to kind of work out a little bit more about it. If you want to hear a little bit more about my research, engage with my research, or just hang out, contact details are on screen. Give thanks, really appreciate you spending your time with us today. Thank you.